Board of Adjustment is a quasi-judicial body that is governed by the North Carolina General Statutes and the city's Unified Development Ordinance. We are authorized to hear requests for variances from the city's UDO, appeals from final determinations by city officials charged with enforcement of the city's UDO, requests for reasonable accommodations, and other requests as may be provided in the city's ordinances. Our first agenda item is the review and adoption of the minutes for the March 24th, 2025 regular meeting. Is there a motion? Can I get a second? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Our second agenda item is the review and adoption of the minutes of the April 28th, 2025 regular meeting. Great. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Excellent. We now begin the evidentiary hearings for the cases listed on the agenda. In hearing cases, the board conducts a quasi-judicial evidentiary hearing. That means it is like a court hearing. State law sets specific procedures and rules concerning how this board must make its decisions. These rules are different from some other types of land use decisions like rezoning cases, which are legislative in nature. This board's decisions are constrained by the standards in the city's ordinance and the facts presented at the hearing. The board hears and considers evidence presented at the hearing and applies the standards set forth in state law and the city's ordinance. The board must base its decisions upon competent material and substantial evidence presented at the hearing. If you will be speaking as a witness, please focus on the facts and standards, not personal preference or opinion. Participation is limited. This meeting is open to the public. Everyone is welcome to watch. Parties have rights to participate fully. Parties may present evidence, call witnesses, and make legal arguments. Witnesses may testify as to facts to which they are competent to testify, so long as those facts relate to the legal standards. In addition, lay or non-expert witness testimony is limited to facts, not opinions. For certain topics, the board needs to hear opinion testimony from expert witnesses. These topics include projections about impacts on property values and projections about impacts on traffic safety. For variance requests, a 4/5 vote of the board is required to grant the variance. For all other hearings and matters, including the adoption of minutes, the decision will be made by a simple majority vote of the board. Witnesses must swear or affirm their testimony. So at this time, we will administer the oath for all individuals who intend to provide witness testimony. If you will please stand and raise your right hand if you plan to provide testimony. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the evidence you shall give to the board in this action shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, I have said a lot of words, and you've turned off the air, so I'm going to fan myself for a second.
Yeah.
Okay, our first case today is a variance, and the petitioner, Jesse Swords, on behalf of owners of Nightcap LLC, is requesting a variance to the setback standards in section 789F5, setback standards of the Unified Development Ordinance. The applicant is seeking relief from the required office district setbacks for the rear property line of 15 feet as part of an exempt subdivision. The property is known as 176 East Chestnut Street and has a PIN of 9649439480. Sam Starbaum, Planner 3, will be presenting the case this afternoon.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair and members of the board. Again, for the record, my name is Sam Starbaum. I'm Planner 3 with Planning and Urban Design. And what we have before us today is a number of variances. We're starting off with a setback variance, which is owing to the age of the structure. My presentation today will follow most of the other presentations you've seen that aren't flood related. So we're going to start with what this variance request is, and then get into some maps and some context before we get into the actual application. So as Chair Godzia just said, what we're looking at is just a setback variance for the location of the innkeeper structure in relation to the rear yard. We are not looking to approve the subdivision. We are not looking to approve future actions. What we are only looking at today is the variance for the rear yard setback for a proposed exempt subdivision. And again, this is happening at 176 East Chestnut. This should give some context of where that is. You can see the property on the left image in a blue square, and then you can see the star on the right of where this is in relation to the rest of Asheville. It's darn near the geometric center, but you would know this area as evenly spaced between Merriman on the left and Charlotte on the right in that left image. And this is currently a bed and breakfast in the primary structure, and then the innkeeper residence is that second structure. We'll look at that a little closer, but this is an area, as you can see, certainly from the image on the left, which is remarkably close to downtown, the central business district, and then also a bevy of mixed uses, and that's reflected, of course, in our zoning map. This is what my colleague Clay Mitchell and I call zoning potpourri. There is no one coherent zoning here. It's a real mix of things, and again, that's reflected in the uses between retail, coffee shops, butchers, lawyers' offices, all sorts of other professional, medical, dental offices, grocery stores. This is all here. This is, of course, happening in office, which is a permissive use, which allows a wide range of uses, including but not limited to residential and office uses. We'll get to that a little bit later, but you will also see a predominant, I'm going to call it purple shade of CB1 and CB2. That's Community Business 1 and Community Business 2. Whatever you have in your head, that's exactly what you're picturing for Merriman and Charlotte. That's the sign the zoning is working, because that's what's allowed in the area, and that's what it looks for is more neighborhood scale community businesses, right, of varying scale. So again, this is where we are looking at. This is 176 East Chestnut. You can see the front view on East Chestnut. That red structure, that home, that two-story home was constructed in 1905. That is the bed and breakfast. There is no parking for that along Chestnut. That is instead accessed to the rear along Washington. That is also in your packet. And then you can see the blue structure, which is also a two-story structure with garage entrance. That is the innkeeper residence. That is the secondary residence, and that is what is being discussed today, right? Because that is approximately 0 to 1.3 feet off the rear property line. The innkeeper residence was built in 1950, which was fully 47 years before our zoning code, so that is what we call existing non-conforming, but the applicants seek what we call a exempt subdivision, which is a subdivision saying that they do not need to meet other statutory standards for subdivisions, but they do have to meet zoning standards. And the only standard they cannot meet today is that rear setback, again, because that home was constructed between 0 and 1.3 feet off that rear property line.
And so why is it exempt subdivision?
I will let the applicant's petitioner answer that. It is a unique thing. I have worked in many states across the American West. I've worked in the Midwest. I have never seen an exempt subdivision. I am prepared to say that's a fairly uniquely North Carolina thing. But what it's saying is that certain subdivision standards from the North Carolina general statutes don't apply, but zoning standards still would. So even though it is exempt from subdivision standards, planning and urban design still reviews these subdivisions as exempt subdivisions for compliance with our local standards. It just means it's a little bit quicker to go to the clerk and recorder to get this recorded, and these typically take less time than other minor or major subdivisions. So it's, yeah. And yeah, it is, yeah, that is 101. I will let Mr. Swords provide 202 and 303 for subdivision class, but that is the bare bones.
Community development, is that?
This is zoned office. So I will go back and you can see, I have poorly chosen a blue on a blue background, but this is office, and this is this area where you can see to the left, you'll see mostly community business for Merriman, and then also to the right for Charlotte. This is squarely between that. Yep. So this brings us, again, this just shows you the relation of those two buildings together. Again, on the right, you have that primary structure, that bed and breakfast. On the left, you have the innkeeper's residence. And this gets us to this proposed plat. So this is what the applicant is proposing. This is better seen perhaps in your packets, but what the applicant wants to do is divide these two in this exempt subdivision. So each property is on a separate, or each structure is on a separate property. So what you will have is the parking and then the innkeeper residence on the north parcel, and then 176, the bed and breakfast, on its own parcel. This is the only nonconformity that exists on this proposed plat is, again, that location of this innkeeper residence, which is sloped. It does not run parallel with the property line. It runs from about 0 feet to 1.3 feet off the property line, so the applicants are seeking a 90 to 95% variance for that location, because in office, your rear setbacks are 15 feet, and that's too close to the property line. Now, I have also noted that in what the applicant has provided, the Board of Adjustment does not work for the orientation of the southern parcel, which is 176, the bed and breakfast. That is just orientated incorrectly. It should be, the front should actually be along Washington Street, and the rear should actually be going east towards Charlotte. Again, that's for compliance with existing zoning standards to make sure that you have that 15-foot rear setback. Now, interestingly, while we are here for rear setbacks, there are no interior side setbacks. So that is what we are looking at today. And staff does not advocate for or against Board of Adjustment cases. We make no recommendation. We provide facts and findings and provide information that is relevant for you in your purview to make the decision. But this is unique in that staff would ask for staff conditions here should you choose to approve this. The first one is, well, I'll actually start with the second one first. The second one is the easiest, and that is just to make sure that should you approve this, the applicant will submit a revised plat showing that 176 is oriented correctly, so that rear setback isn't, again, towards the innkeeper's residence. It's actually towards Charlotte Street on that eastern property line. That way, that makes that an entirely conforming property. And then the second one is this. In the city of Asheville, if there is an act of God, if there is a force majeure, if there is a hurricane, if there is Godzilla, if there is something that happens to your house, you are allowed to build back exactly where it is. We would seek to have the applicant, should something happen to the innkeeper's residence, be built to the standards of office district, not to what this variance would then allow, right? So if something were to happen, we would rather they meet the setbacks in its entirety of that base district, of that office district, than have them, again, be just right off that property line. So again, the first condition is just making sure that they seek, should the worst happen, that it be rebuilt to the underlying zoning district standards and not what is approved today. But that is a lot of information about something we really don't see a whole lot of at the Board of Adjustment, so I would reserve the rest of my time and answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
So are they going to have a shared parking agreement for the parking that is in front of the carriage house to serve the? Well, forget it. We have to leave now.
We've got redundancies on redundancies. I'll let the applicant answer that. I will say this, that this is even prior to our parking minimum requirements changes at the March 11th council. Parking for residential uses was not required here. There is no parking required for the innkeeper's residence. My understanding is the intent to have some sort of shared easement, but again, I will let the applicant speak to that. But
I was thinking for the bed and breakfast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll let the applicant speak to that.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Sam?
And actually, Chair, if I can amend my answer, I want to be clear again. So subdivisions, you're exempt from subdivision standards. You're not exempt from zoning requirements, which means that we do look at parking as a requirement of this subdivision. So they would have to submit something showing that the parking is met for bed and breakfast.
So you're just not there yet?
Yeah.
Got it.
No.
Sam, just for clarification, it's only the innkeeper one that's being presented now, or there was a second one, the
So
setback behind the existing one. I know that you followed up and said that you thought that one a variance as well.
that does not need a variance. We were able to get this down to one variance request as long as the applicant make that eastern property line. So what they were showing here would have required a secondary variance because there were elements of 176 in the rear setback. If the rear setback were moved to the eastern property line, then no variances are required. This is an entirely conforming site on 176.
Yeah, since it's a corner lot, you have the option of saying what is your primary face.
Mhm.
And since it looks like there's two prominent front features,
Mhm.
both on Washington
Yeah.
and on Chestnut, it looks like you can kind of pick or choose. And so by picking Washington, your rear setback is compliant and there is no side setback required.
Correct.
I was just clarifying because
Yeah.
there was an email that followed the original. You might want to show the map that's applicable
presentation or additional testimony for the board to consider?
Hi, my name is Jesse Swords. I'm a land use attorney with Allen Stahl and Kilbourne here in Asheville. And I can tell you guys are just dying to hear about exempt subdivisions, so I will start with that. So I think exempt subdivision is maybe a misleading name for it. I think of it as a simplified process for a subdivision, and it's created by North Carolina statute. There are certain types of divisions of land for which, you know, a local government cannot impose an extensive review process. And, you know, these are the types of things that don't require an extensive review process because they're fairly simple. So for this one, the elements are, it's a division of a tract in single ownership whose area is no greater than 2 acres into not more than 3 lots where no street right-of-way dedication is involved and where the resultant lots are equal to or exceed the standards of the city. So obviously, you know, the existing lot's under 1 owner. It is 0.4 acres. It will create 2 lots, and there's no changes to the streets right-of-way or anything like that. Also, I want to point out that these aren't going to be funny-shaped lots, so any future construction on, you know, if someone were to come along and decide they wanted to bulldoze the whole thing, you could build according to the, you know, regular setbacks of the office district. I don't expect that to happen with a historic building of this kind. But the regular kind of shape of the lots, I think, is what, you know, is what is consistent with the spirit of the subdivision ordinance. So there will be parking, basically where at the top of the lot, you can see there's like a gravel parking area with some curb stops on it. The in-property will be conveyed with a parking easement to park in an area that's like the current area here. So there will be some parking provided on site. You know, obviously with the current innkeeper's residence remaining a residence, there will be, you know, reduced parking demand compared to, you know, both of these properties were sold, or both of these structures were sold, and the innkeeper residence were converted into office space as well, or something like that. I guess the only thing I really have to add is that, you know, it's public policy of the state of North Carolina, and it's actually spelled out in statute that, and I'll just read from this. Land is a basic resource of the people of the state of North Carolina and should be made freely alienable and marketable so far as is practicable. So really the hardship here is on, you know, the free alienation of real property, which is basically just the property owner's ability to sell it as she sees fit. And of course, it's all a product of the historic nature of the structures and applying, you know, the modern zoning standards that, you know, no I think the first building is 1904, perhaps, and the innkeeper residence is 1950. So long before zoning was contemplated around here. And obviously, this is not an uncommon thing to see with historic properties. So all we're asking for is, you know, to do what the Board of Adjustment does, which is to prevent harsh consequences from arising out of a literal interpretation of, you know, the zoning ordinance. And the other important thing to remember here is this will change absolutely nothing on the ground. It will not change, it will not add any kind of real world new non-conforming issues because obviously the buildings aren't moving, the outer lot line is not moving. You know, it just doesn't really change anything in reality. All it's gonna do is allow the two structures to be sold as 2 separate things. And you know, it's not legally relevant, but the purpose here is the current owner intends to keep the innkeeper's residence as a residence, as her residence, and market the inn building for sale. And it all traces back to Helene and the impact on tourism, but that's not legally relevant either. All we're asking for is the ability to sell these things as the property owner sees fit.
Would you state that general statute again for me, please, that talks about exempt subdivisions? And then if you could read it out again.
So in my letter, I have, it's in the City of Asheville Ordinance 7-15-1B1D.
So we mirror the statute. The city's
And-
ordinance
Okay.
mirrors the statute.
Yeah,
And the
it's-
elements that you can go through those elements again.
Yeah, it's virtually the same or exactly the same. I can't remember which, but the statute would be 160D-7 something. 702 or 70 something. No, the parking is kind of irrelevant too, because there are no parking requirements as of now that I'm aware of. It's for marketability of the inn. Presumably someone will want to be able to park in the existing lot. But to keep the lot sizes and shapes, normal, and meeting the minimum widths and, required area and all that stuff. So I think there are some minor landscaping changes planned, but it will essentially be when the inn property is conveyed, it will be conveyed with an easement for a certain number of parking spaces, which will be a negotiated part of the sale. And when you get a parking easement, it will usually refer to an outline on the plat somewhere, or it can just be, a legal description. But that's up to the closing attorney when that time comes.
So the carriage house is going to be sold as a single-family dwelling unit or sold as something that will have parking for an adjacent business in front of it.
So yes, the current owner plans to continue to reside in that. But as I said, there are some landscaping changes planned. This is a residence that's right in the middle of, urban Asheville. So, it doesn't strike me as particularly off-putting. And in any event, it would be, something for a potential buyer to consider.
Okay, does anyone have any questions for the applicant? Or additional questions for the applicant?
I'm sorry?
Well, Mr. Swartz is the applicant on behalf of the
Yeah,
property
I'm
owner.
representing, this is the property owner, Emily. Yes.
If anyone has any questions for the property owner, you can ask her to come up. I think she was sworn in. Okay, seeing there's no questions, is anyone from the public here that would like to give expert testimony or testimony from residents with standing? Okay, seeing none.
I should also mention that we consent to the staff proposed conditions.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Sam, could you scroll those back up as we continue to talk? Okay. Discussion from the board? Or a motion?
Can't really hear when you're being recorded, so.
And there's nothing that we can do really with the parking because of the current zoning that's there. Any requests for parking or anything added about, because we all seem to have a little concern about future parking.
I think that the
Is there
parking
anything
will,
that we can do?
I think that the parking will get resolved as the plans change, if there are any changes to the plans, and if there's anything that makes those two parcels out of compliance with the zoning code. From what I'm understanding from Mr. Starbaum is that it would have to meet the zoning code in regards to, and that would be parking or landscaping or anything else like that. And so that would probably get all resolved
Take care of all that. Okay.
outside of this variance request today. I was just curious as to whether that had been thought
Yeah, it
of.
was just curiosity for me
Yes.
too, yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks,
Just want you
Sam.
to get a few more steps in, thank you.
Should we make
So
a-
everyone's clear on the request is, so the normal base zoning, it's a 15-foot setback, but obviously the historic building is already there and the setback is, well, I mean. The setback is 15, the building is placed from 0 to 1.3. Right, so it's right on the line, so, and then the condition is just again saying that if that building goes away, is destroyed, when it gets built back, the location has to be adjusted to meet the underlying, to meet that 15-foot setback or whatever the zoning setback is at the time that it gets rebuilt. If that makes sense, this is the proposed language from the applicant, and just make sure that you think that condition conveys that.
Yeah, I think we were mostly on that first condition, wanting to make sure it made sense to y'all, just as the way it's written.
Yeah, yes, that condition makes sense to me. As we think about buildings being demolished due to natural disasters, it could stand to reason that there would be a desire to bring the building further into the site, obviously, thus reducing some parking that may possibly be a shared parking arrangement with whatever business is going on. But that is not what we're here for today. Today, we're here for a 15-foot variance request for the rear setback of the carriage house. So I think we're all in agreement that some of these things we can't predict. Okay, anyone else have any questions or discussion, or is there a motion? And if you do want to make a motion, if you could include the two conditions, either by reference of conditions 1 and 2, or you could read them all if you wish.
Motion to approve the variance in accordance with the staff conditions verbatim as shown on slide 8 of the board's packet for this case.
Great. All right, board members, when I say your name, please say aye or nay. Elliot Smith? John Michael Cletus?
Aye.
James Warnall?
Aye.
Annette Wise?
Aye.
Suzanne Gotze is an aye, so variance. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to move to our flood-related variances. The applicant, Joseph Fitzgerald, is requesting variances to the standards in sections 712.1E2B and 712.1E2E, flood hazard reduction of the UDO. The purpose of the request is to allow for the repair of a historic structure without fully complying with the flood protection standards in order to preserve its historic character. And the property is known as 14 Lodge Street and has PIN number of 9648 60 42 79, and Sam Starbaum, Planner 3, is presenting this case as well.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Again, for the record, Sam Starbaum, Planner 3, Planning and Urban Design Department. What we have here will be a series of flood variances. All my presentations for this will look the same. It will also mirror, for those of you who were here last month, for our first complete flood variance. It's going to look a lot like that. There are really only 1 or 2 minor changes. I would also say that we are so fortunate to have Nancy Watford here with us for FEMA and floodplain clarifications. So if you have any questions about that as we go along, please know that we do have resources available to answer that. So I started with flood variance 101 last month. We'll do the same this month just for this quick refresher. What happens is you have a total building value. We will say hypothetically it is $1 million. If your cost to repair the building back to the standard exceeds $501,000, which is to say 50% more of the building value from this building that was damaged in the storm, then your building is substantially damaged, and that means you have to repair to FEMA standards, and you have to elevate everything to the regulatory flood elevation, which is 2 feet above the base flood elevation, which is several feet above where most of Biltmore Village is. So that is what a flood variance is. And then, of course, there are exceptions, which bring us here today. If you are a historic structure, if you are in a historic district, and there are reasons for this to say, well, this would impact the historic character. If we raised HVAC and we raised electrical above regulatory flood elevation, we would have a whole bunch of air conditioning units on stilts, which would be very visible from everywhere in town. So this is what we're looking at, is to make sure that we can maintain the historic character, which in many cases helped these buildings survive the storm. And that's what we have today. So the last time I started with what the repair cost and the building value is and how this is in excess of 50%. This is a little different for this one. So 14 Lodge Street is actually not substantially damaged. What we have is that it is at 34%, 34.6, basically 35% of that substantial damage, right? So that we're still fully 15% away from substantially damaged. The best appraisal we have for that building right now is $571,000. Approximate cost for building, again, not anything new, just back to what it was the day before the storm, that Thursday, is just under $200,000. So why is this getting a variance then? Well, for this reason alone. What happens is we want to make sure that the cart isn't put before the horse. What happens when you get into construction costs and construction timelines and resource availability and resource costs usually go up. It is rare that construction meets a budget, and so what we want to do is we want to make sure that these buildings, as they are going through that process, have the variance that they can meet the FEMA standards, not 100%, but to the extent practicable in ways that can preserve the historic structure. Because if they were able to start this permit process, if they were starting to repair and then realized, oh no, we're going to exceed 50%, then they would not be able to get a flood variance because they have already pulled a development permit. So what we are doing is we are cautioning business owners, property owners, and anyone in the historic Biltmore Village to act out of an abundance of caution and go ahead and get these variances, even if you're in that 30 to 40% range, because 10 to 20% creeps in quickly in construction. So that is why we are before you today with a variance for a substantial damage, even though that is not the case. Again, we're at 34.6. So there are standards for variances. I had covered this. There are really three, your prerequisites: a written report from floodplain administrator. Check, that is Exhibit A. That is in all of your documents for all the ensuing flood variances. Then you do have these special requirements. Again, I would like to draw attention to no development permit has been approved, which brings us here for a lot of these which are not substantially damaged, and some other ones. There are other standards for review of flood variances. And then last, you still have your findings of fact. These four are your bread and butter here as the Board of Adjustment. They were included in the UDO. I put them here. Again, I'm not going to read this wall of text, but these are the things you look at for, right? This is generally good and sufficient cause exists. This is not caused by the homeowner. This is no different than what you saw last month for those of you that were here. Again, really the only difference is that this is not substantially damaged, but because of its value, it is in danger of going that as we get further in the construction process. So again, what we're looking for is a flood variance. What this is saying is that they will meet, to the extent practicable, the FEMA standards. Again, using gypsum board instead of drywall. What we're not saying is that they're going to elevate this building all the way. And this is at 14 Lodge Street. Here you can see where this is, Exhibit B. A lot of these are on Lodge Street for the rest of the afternoon, so this image is going to look really familiar. This is the one very close to 32 Hendersonville Road. You can see that there. It's hosted a lot of businesses. It was last known as Provisions Mercantile most recently, and that was a building that was constructed in 1920. This is the most common zoning district for the Biltmore Village Historic District. It's going to be exactly what you saw in that last presentation of purple. It's Community Business 1, Community Business 2, which is sort of this low scale, high intensity, which is number of buildings, low density, which is like height, and per acre of people. So it's going to look what you find in Biltmore Village. That's very common, just that what we see there, and that's a sign that community business has been a successful zoning district. And then this is your flood hazard map showing where this is. This is very clearly in a flood hazard area that would qualify this for this flood variance. All the information about the regulatory flood elevation, 2 feet below that, the base flood elevation, and where this building sits is in that staff report. And you can see that generally, your BFE is going to be 1,997 feet. This building is 3 to 4 feet below that. And if they were not able to get that variance, everything has to go up to that regulatory flood elevation of 1,999 feet, and that would certainly impact the historic character. Here you can see what this structure looks like. I'm sure most of you have seen this as you've been driving this area on Lodge Street, going to Sweeten Creek. This is an older photo, but this is a good photo. It shows what it is and the surrounding area. And then this is the same thing for the other flood variance that we saw last month. Pursuant to Nancy's staff report, there are several conditions on here that we would ask. Again, we're not making recommendations. We just ask that these, should you choose to approve this, this would make staff's life easier and make it easier for tracking. So these would be things that we would ask be included. This is a little different. 14 Lodge Street has already received a certificate of appropriateness. That is something that just wasn't done at time of publication. So that is still included in the staff conditions. You can still include that. That would be very easy to meet. And it also just makes sure that they continue to work with Alex Cole should there be any changes to change orders, construction materials, things like that. And then everything else, again, elevating and flood protecting to the extent practicable. And these 7 conditions look the same for this as it was for the last flood variance and will be for the next cases we see throughout the rest of the afternoon. But largely, this is the building we're looking at, and this is the building that I would say that this is the average building that had the average Helene experience, and that in many ways it's the age of construction and how it was constructed allowed the water to pass through it, so requiring some of these other things like dry flood proofing, which is making sure water can't pass through, then poses additional issues by putting water and more pressure on there. So what the applicant seeks to do, again, is nothing beyond what it was the day before the storm. And that's a lot of information about a flood variance, and this is on a good day, a tremendously nuanced subject, so I would be happy to stand for any questions that you may have.
I had mentioned to you prior to the meeting about dry flood proofing, and just for information for the board, if they're not aware, because I'm not 100% aware. You mentioned it in your presentation just now, but could you go into that a little bit more detail, like what it is exactly?
Dry flood proofing is putting up, it would be something on the interior, and Alex Cole is really the one that can speak to this. I will also let Nancy speak to this a little bit, but it is finding ways to flood proof the exterior. The brick buildings were porous and allowed water to pass through, which helped relieve pressure and helped relieve water exposure over long term instead of keeping it there. So in many instances, what we saw with these brick buildings and some of these other historic buildings is that by allowing the water to pass through and its historic nature, they actually fared better. And would Nancy add anything to that? Like you.
I think Sam did pretty well. It is waterproofing the exterior of the building, and it has a lot to do with the structural integrity as to whether an existing building can be flood-proofed. And with that, like when you have lower windows tend to be the areas where you cannot put floodgates. You can put them around doors, but that's where the break point in the structural integrity of the building, when you're dealing with basically trying to make it the opposite of vacuum, like the water's outside the building, so there's hydrodynamic pressures pushing on the structure as the water is flowing through and around it instead of through it, because it keeps a majority of the water out. Doesn't always keep all of the water out, but it's like a mop it up instead of muck it out.
And so for these buildings that are in Biltmore Village and elsewhere in the city that are historic and have been impacted by the flood, the ones that have these glass storefronts really don't have the opportunity to be dry flood proofed, at least in their entirety. I don't know about on the
Right.
back sides or whatever, but for the storefront portions, they're not able to do that.
Correct, and a lot of it also has to do with their brick facade. So the brick is not just a facade for these structures, it's often their building components and the structural portion of the building as well. So those allow the water to come through the mortar, because the mortar's like sand and the brick is really hard, but it allows the water to come through the mortar and into the building, which relieves pressure on the walls. So we saw a few less wall failures and building failures where when some of the buildings that are more new construction type did not have that and they failed. So and a lot of times because it's doing stuff to the exterior, it is hard to both meet the flood proofing regulations based on how high it has to go, but then also in combination with the historic character. So that's where if you're putting stuff, barriers and flood-resistant materials on the outside, it tends to affect that historic character to a greater extent than a lot of the interior work.
So again, just for education, and I'm assuming we're going to be seeing lots of these in the coming little while. So say you had a brick box for the front door, and you could dry flood-proof it. What would a building material be? What would that actually look like? Or would you just not do it?
On the exterior, there are a couple
Okay.
in this area.
Is it a specific product?
I'm
Is
not-
it a building technique? Or I'm
It's
just trying to
oftentimes a
understand,
building technique,
Okay.
but there is waterproofing because it is new construction, so there's waterproofing that keeps the water out.
Okay.
You may have brick facade still, and then you'll have steel framing, not stick built,
Okay.
that sort of thing. And those then allow for the floodgates to be installed on a door or an apturance that would allow for the public safety of getting in and out of the building. And there are a lot of proprietary devices that you can purchase for those floodgates, or you can have an engineer design it for you.
But all have the potential to impact the historic integrity of our buildings and, all right.
There is a water resistant, so part of this is anything interior that is new. So say you don't have an ADA bathroom and you're ripping out the bathroom and you're putting in new walls, right? Those new walls then have to be constructed of flood resistant materials because they're new components. They're not, the wall wasn't existing there before. That sort of, if you have an existing wall, you can replace it with typical drywall. Because oftentimes that's a wood stud anyway, so you're gonna have to rip whatever you put on there off to let the studs dry. So that being said, so that's where they use the flood-resistant materials on new components only, as part of that trying to meet as much of the flood ordinance as possible. But all of that work is typically interior, because interior in our historic districts, the interior has less impact on that historic character and the historic status. And that's in our historic districts. That is not. Everybody else has their own historic stuff, so.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Does anyone have any other questions for Nancy or for Sam? No? Okay. Do the applicants have a presentation or additional testimony?
I am David Ross. I am the contractor for this building, all the ones that you're doing the variance for. So Joseph actually is the one that, filled out the application, but I'm actually the contractor. Just to be clear, what we were doing is, again, repairing everything like kind. So basically everything's going back as much as historic as possible. We're working with HRC to make sure that is all happening. We have CAs on most of that stuff, windows, doors, that kind of stuff. Again, just the type of product that it is, being wood and being that is not is prone to problems with flood. So what this building and all the other buildings, what we're doing is providing panels up to the height of where we feel we can protect. If you look at this building, which is 14 Lodge, you can see right there that there's about 20 inches of that marble that comes up. And so we're providing panels that will allow at least 20 inches to come up, because we know we can keep that out, right? Once it gets above that window seal height, then it's almost impossible to keep that force of the water out. So basically what we're doing is informing all of our clients to do their best to flood protect anything they can for the future, right? Obviously, for an event that we just had, there's really no other way to protect it. It's actually better to allow the floodwaters in and through the building. And so, we're basically trying to educate them, all the clients, about what is going to be the best practice and what is the best way to preserve the building in the future, right? So if you have any questions about this particular project, again, I think they've pretty much done a really good job actually of filling you in with what we're up against. But basically, this building in particular, right now, they don't have the cost to repair does not exceed the 50%, but we're having to get that variance because we don't have a tenant. Matt, who is the owner of the building, doesn't have a tenant yet. And of course, that tenant may have an upfit, could be elaborate. And so at that time, the only thing, we've moved everything up as far as the mechanical system, plumbing systems, everything as high as possible. The only problem was the electric, was that the current is in the back. They don't really have room for a platform, and we're having to meet with Duke, and they're actually more stringent on the height than we are as far as code, because they're at 5'6" or something to the meter base, where we're at 6'8" for electric code. So we're working through all that with Duke, but they've really been the ones pushing the height of what we're allowed to do.
Okay. Great. Does anyone have any questions for the applicant? I feel like all this has been very informative for me and certainly for all of us moving forward. So it might be a good idea, Sam, as if we have any other members that come on board in the next couple of months, that we tag the YouTube video at the minute mark that you guys shared all of your fantastic information, and have them just listen to that as for their own information and education. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Is anyone from the public here that would like to give expert testimony or testimony from residents with standing? I don't think so. Okay, great. Seeing none, is there a discussion from the board, or is there a motion?
Motion to approve the variance
Go ahead, Mr.
in
Warnock.
accordance with the staff conditions verbatim as shown on slide 10 of the packet presented to the board.
Can I get a second? Great. All right, board members, when I say your name, please say aye or nay. Elliott Smith? John Michael Cletus?
Aye.
James Warnall?
Aye.
Annette Wise?
Aye.
Suzanne Godsey is an aye, so that variance passes. Our third variance and second flood variance, the applicant Joseph Fitzgerald is requesting a variance to the standards in section 712.1E2B and 712.1E2E flood hazard reduction of the UDO, and the purpose of the request is to allow for the repair of a historic structure without fully complying with the flood protection standards in order to preserve its historic character. The property is known as 22 Lodge Street, and the PIN number for this property is 9648605323. And up again is Sam Starbaum.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a one-man show today. I apologize in advance for that. We have 22 Lodge Street. This presentation will go, I think, a little bit quicker. Again, this is, I intentionally, not necessarily for the board, but for myself, to keep this clear, kept just the same presentation. I will not go over this information. I will stop here and say that, again, 22 is exactly like 18. This is one that is not yet substantially damaged, but that is a concern as we are moving forward. We just don't want the applicant to be penalized by pulling a development permit only to find that they are, in fact, over that allowed threshold, and this 122 is closer to that 50% than 14 was. And these are the standards. These are the same standards you've seen in the presentation. Again, this is the same variance that you just saw for 14. This is 22. This is this flood variance. I wanted to point something out about that gypsum board question is, again, what we are doing here is we are not saying they're totally exempt forever for always from FEMA standards. What we're saying is they will meet it to the extent practicable to ensure that the historic character is maintained. Electric is a good cause for that too, right? So Alex and I met on site with Duke. Well, we've done that often over the last 7 or 8 months, and what's happening is it's not just that it has to be elevated and new mechanical equipment. There are also worker and Duke employee safety concerns. So now that these are ramps, these are pedestals, it is a whole almost other appurtenance just to make sure that this is met. And of course, if you put all electric and all the associated ramps, stairs, ladders, everything that Duke is looking for, that totally changes the historic nature of that building, and that's what brings us here today. So it is not just electric, but that is one good example. And again, gypsum board where, again, they are not exempt from totally meeting the standards on the interior. They have to just do so where it is practicable. But for those things that impact the historic structure, they still, that is something that we look at. So here we are, again, this is just a few doors down. This is just north of 1997 for its base flood elevation, the regulatory flood elevation, again, 2 feet above that. This building is substantially lower than that, so you would have to elevate the entire building or do some sort of flood proofing. Alex has provided, again, as she did for all of these flood variances, that information saying that this is a historic structure. This would be impacted by that, and that is there in your exhibits. This is the street view. It was Mountain Merch. It's also one of those buildings that has had a number of tenants over the years, and I will also let the applicant to speak whether or not Mountain Merch will be going back. But this is the building. This is, I think, when I think of the historic Biltmore Village, there's a lot of this architectural character that I would see. This is really emblematic of what they're looking at, but you can see where this is certainly lower than some of these other buildings, even with that ramp to the front door. Again, same 7 staff conditions on this one as all the other ones, and that is my presentation. So I would happily answer any questions you may have.
Does anyone have any questions for Sam? Okay, great. I'm assuming same applicant.
Yep.
Do you have a presentation or additional testimony for the board to consider?
Come up to
Yep.
The only thing I would like to add is this actually building fared the best, and basically Carl Kuhn hired me after the last flood, and basically we did actually do a membrane on that. We raised it, did a slab, did a membrane. So basically this actually did fare extremely well. So again, it's interesting because we were like, how well is it going to do? And then actually did the best of all the buildings because we did do everything we can. So again, I'm pressing with all of the clients to do as much as we possibly can because again, anything that you can do to shore up the building, to make it more flood resistant, of course, is wonderful, right? And obviously less work to do to this one than, of course, like the next 2 buildings you're about to see, right? But anyway, I just wanted to add that since that was interesting that this is one that was prepared many years ago and fared very well.
Interesting test case, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, wish we didn't have to have that test.
Unfortunately, having to go through the flood twice now,
Yeah.
we'll rebuild them again if we need.
Understood. Is anyone from the public here that would like to give expert testimony or testimony from residents withstanding? No? Is there discussion amongst the board, or is there a motion? With the conditions? Is there a second? Great. Board members, when I say your name, please say aye or nay. Elliot Smith? John Michael Cletus?
Aye.
James Warnall?
Aye.
Annette Wise? Suzanne Godsey is an aye. That variance passes. For next variance, applicant Joseph Fitzgerald is requesting variances to the standards in the sections 7121E2B and 7121E2E flood hazard reduction of the UDO. The purpose of the request is to allow for the repair of a historic structure without fully complying with the flood protection standards in order to preserve its historic character. This property is known as 26 Lodge Street and is PIN number 9648606313. Sam Starbaum is
Thanks, Madam Chair. This is the last time we're moving east. We are looking at 26 Lodge, which is known as the Southern Highlands Craft Guild. This is one that was built in 1928. Again, this is one of those between 35 and 45 where we have counseled the applicants to provide the variance application anyways. We do think that the value on that building is artificially low. What we have found is that the tax assessor has provided sort of a lower number on that appraisal. So why we have not seen more variances is people have gone and they have found the independent appraisal saying, wow, our structure isn't actually worth $300,000. It's actually worth $3 million, which totally changes the equation of what 50% or substantially damaged would be. This is one of those where I suspect we could easily find some sort of independent analysis that would say this building is worth substantially more than that. That's not the case. This is what we have on file. So the smart thing to do is to get the variance. Again, same slides, same applicant, same request, just for this flood variance. We'll meet this to the extent practicable. Selected incorrectly. Or what I had done is selected the wrong images, but this is actually just the building to the right. This is what we're looking at. This building is the correct building. This is 26 Lodge Street. This is where Southern Highlands Craft is. This is, again, constructed in 28, and we're looking for the same staff conditions here. I can provide more specific details as to this one as it varies from the rest of them, but again, it's mostly just going to be minor about how there's just small, subtle differences in where the building is relative to that base flood elevation, and then 2 feet above that for the regulatory elevation. But since we've seen a lot of these, I'll stand for any questions.
Are there any unique questions for Sam on this variance? Okay. Do the applicants have a presentation or any additional testimony they would like the board to consider on this one?
No, unless you have any questions. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer anything that you might have.
I do not have any questions.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for coming up. Okay, is anyone from the public here that would like to give expert testimony or testimony from residents withstanding? No one has come in. Is there discussion for the board, or would someone like to make a motion? Okay, can I get a second?
Second.
Board members, when I say your name, please say aye or nay. Elliot Smith? John Michael Cletus?
Aye.
James Warnall?
Aye.
Annette Wise? Suzanne Godsey is an aye. That variance passes. Our last variance for today is applicant Joseph Fitzgerald is requesting a variance to the standards in section 712.1E2B and 712.1E2E flood hazard reduction of the UDO. And the purpose of the request is to allow for the repair of a historic structure without fully complying with the flood protection standards in order to preserve its historic character. The property is known as 32 Hendersonville Road, and PIN number is 9648604302. And Sam Starbaum is up to present.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. For the last one, again, this is going to be the same presentation. This is a little bit different. We are actually not going east at this point. We're going all the way west to that corner of Lodge Street and Hendersonville Road. This is addressed as 32 Hendersonville Road. It's actually 2 structures addressed as one, which was later fused into one building, one edifice. There was a wall knocked down. You'll see that soon. This is one of those where this is probably the lowest of that percentage, but this is still something that the applicant is seeking just because this is a larger square footage and there may be other damages. So the applicant is still just seeking the variance, even though they are below that substantial damage threshold because of construction costs and resource materials. Who knows what's going to happen with that in the next year. These are these processes. I will happily stop there if you have any questions. I had mentioned again that this is 32. This is the correct Exhibit B. This is what 32 is. It is the host to a number of restaurants and businesses over the years. I think most recently and most commonly was known as the host of Andaz, the fine Indian cuisine area, but there are other artists and other artist studios and small offices on the top of that building. You can see here that flood map, and you can sort of see how there is 2 buildings there again. That roof line shows it a little bit better. It is the northernmost was constructed in 23. The southernmost was constructed in 27. At some point, a wall between them went down, and it became 32 Hendersonville as one larger singular edifice. And this is the flood map. This is another area where you tracks, but this is almost at the intersection of 1,999 and 1,997 for that base flood elevation, which means that your regulatory flood elevation is about 2 feet below that, and the land is actually lower, which means that were they not to receive the variance, or if they were to commit the mistake of pulling a development permit prior to getting the variance, they would then have to elevate everything to that regulatory flood elevation, so that would go much higher, and that would most certainly impact the historic character. So again, anytime where we see, even if it is a lower number of that substantial damage ratio, because that regulatory flood elevation is higher, we counsel applicants to apply for that, just to make sure that there's plenty of room to spare in this work as we go to the business of restoring the historic Biltmore Village. Here's what this looks like. This is facing sort of north-northwest along Hendersonville Road. You're moving towards 70 Court Plaza there. You can see this from Google Maps, and you can see where Andaz is on that first floor. You can also see a little bit as you move further north along there where my mouse is, where that other building is. There's just a bit of a break there. I thought I had another photo, but you can see where there are also, from that directory, you can see those other businesses that are listed along the second floor for that structure. So that's my presentation. Same conditions, same concerns from the floodplain administrator and from Alex Cole, our historic resources planner. The only thing I would say is 14 Lodge Street is the only one that did get their certificate of appropriateness at the time. There is no concern that the other ones cannot get that. It's just one of those where we include that condition for all of them, just to make sure that they're continuously working with Alex to make sure that all historic elements are met as we continue that process of rebuilding. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Sam on this one? Okay, great. Does the applicant have anything they would like to say about this specific variance request?
I actually just want to take this opportunity to thank both the Board of Adjustments and Sam and Nancy for helping us so much through this process. It's been a little bit arduous. We've gone back and forth about what are the best options and how, and they really helped a lot to us to understand what is our best path forward, because I, for one, own this building I actually own, but I'm also the contractor for all these other people, so I'm been really trying to understand and figure out our ways to rebuild. So I just thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Right?
Thank you. I do not believe there is anyone from the public here that would like to give expert testimony, but if you are going to say something, no. All right. There's no one else here for residents withstanding. Is there a discussion from the board, or is there a motion? Can I get a second?
Second.
Board members, when I say your name, please say aye or nay. Elliott Smith. John Michael Cletus.
Aye.
James Warnall.
Aye.
Annette Wise.
Aye.
Suzanne Godsey is an aye, and the variance is approved.
Good luck to you.
Yes, good luck. You have quite a bit of work cut out for you, personally and professionally.
I think it's worth noting how great those buildings have withstood compared to some of the others and maybe across the street from there.
Well, it's nice to be 18 inches thick, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We actually have the telephone pole that went through the back, but it actually created a pillow, so I think that it actually helped with that. It really
Wow.
is quick. So we kind of, I feel fortunate to rebuild it.
Well, I think we all feel fortunate that everyone is rebuilding. So that's nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do we have any new business or? Yes, please, if you would, Ms. Ashley.
Yes, so I'd like to introduce you to our new Assistant City Attorney, Carly Gillingham, who will be sitting in with you mainly for the Board of Adjustment